Shalom, and welcome to Episode 6 of the Great Tribulation, the most amazing prophecy. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 6, the most amazing prophecy. Well, Bob, in our last episode, Secrets Revealed, we ended on the three veils in the Second Temple, but there's still some more detail we need to cover. And so what I wanted to know is, were the veils replaced occasionally?
Yes, they were replaced every 6 months. They were braided, of course, by 82 young damsels, as it says. They wouldn't want mature ladies with arthritic joints because they wanted this thing to be perfect, much as possible. And they were probably teenage girls. They used 74 cords of 22 threads each. And as I understand the veil, it was a hand-bread, but it had on it cherubims and stars, and I think maybe palm trees. They won't let people see an image of the veil. They're afraid someone will make a replica of it. I am honored by having Barbara and our names engraved in a brass plaque as members of the Temple Society. They won't even give little old me a picture of the veil. I've tried everywhere I know. They don't want anybody copying it. It's sacred.
Now, why is that?
Because it hangs in front of the entrance to the temple. Inside the temple is even more sacred. In the Exodus, it describes it as an hanging. There's a Greek word for the veil that says something that spreads out and hangs down. Okay.
So, is there any numerical significance to 82 damsels, 74 cords, and 22 threads?
Not that I know of, other than the fact I think it's a physical requirement. In order to get the veil to be 4 finger breadths thick, they needed to have braids of that configuration, that many cords, that many threads.
It was that thick. How tall was it?
60 feet.
Wow.
30 feet wide.
Wow.
Yeah. They call it a veil, but that's not really a veil. They don't really have a word for
curtain?
Anything else. Yeah, later on, it's in Josephus, he calls it a Babylonian curtain, and which is more descriptive of what it really was. The other 2 veils inside separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place.
So then when these veils were replaced, did they actually replace this every 6 months, the entire thing, or did they refurbish it?
They replaced it every 6 months.
My gosh, that must have been immensely expensive.
In between times, they did wash it because it was exposed to the weather and dust and so forth. There were some ceremonies where they threw blood on, It took 300 priests to immerse it and lift it.
Oh.
Well, imagine, they must have been bruisers, the guys that did that even.
Oh, man. I can just imagine it. Next question I have about the veils is, who were allowed to see the veils?
The temple court, the court of women, was restricted to women and children who were not permitted to go up the 13 steps up to the court of the Israelites to make the offering.
Mm.
Only Jewish men were allowed to go up there. And if they were lepers, those men were not allowed to go through the gate. There were priests there to accept their sacrifice for them. Now, the only way you could see the veil would be from inside the gate.
Mm-hmm.
Standing down in the court of women, they wouldn't be able to see it at all.
Mm.
Maybe on feast days they could see part of it. But there was one place.
Well, hold on a second. Let me ask you something, because I mean, you already told me we had 82 damsels.
Yeah.
That they're making this every 6 months.
Yeah.
But women in the public were not allowed to actually see it up close?
Oh, not up close, no. The only place you could see the veil in its entirety was from the Mifkat altar up on the Mount of Olives.
Mm-hmm.
The priest was supposed to sprinkle the blood. When the sun came up behind him, the sun would illuminate the curtain, and he would see this beautiful hues of red and purple and gold.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite a sight, and he had to be able to see that. If a cloud came across the sun, everything's off. But because of that restriction, the Jews were proud of their veil, and so when each time they got a new veil, they would spread it out on the colonnades roofs. The colonnades were those little walkways around the edge of the courts,
Mm-hmm.
and they would put the veil on there, and then people could stand up on the Mount of Olives, and they wouldn't have to stand where the priest was at the Mifkat altar at all. Lots of people could see it, even Gentiles already, and that's the only way they could see it.
Okay.
They were very proud of it
Oh.
because it was a beautiful piece of work.
So they would put it on exhibit for how long?
I don't know how long, and probably depended on the weather and things like that.
That's interesting. Closing question on this with the veil is going back to the 82 damsels. Tell me about the process by which these gals were selected. I mean, yeah, they didn't have the age issue with arthritis in the hands, but was that the sole requirement, or did these girls have to have some sort of special lineage, attributes, schooling, something?
I haven't seen anything on that, but just logic tells us that they had to be nimble of fingers and probably perform before a board of people to show that they, in fact, could braid and knit this veil at a speed that would be compatible with their goal. One thing I wanted to say here about there was only one spot on the Mount of Olives, the Mifkat altar, from where you could see the veil.
Mm-hmm.
And that was on days when the Nicanor's gate was open.
Mm-hmm.
And in Talmud it says, when the priest sprinkles the blood, he must carefully direct his gaze. And that's because he can't be walking around out there. It's a space about the size of my desk here.
Mm-hmm.
If he walks too far to the left, wall would obscure part of the door.
Mm-hmm.
And if he walks too far backwards, it would cut off the top of it. And if he walks too far forward, and so forth. He had to stand in a particular place, and he couldn't cough or sneeze or nothing.
Wow.
He had to be exactly precise at that position. It's intriguing to me that the Jewish law is fascinating to me,
Mm-hmm.
even as a Christian, because like we've discussed before, it's strengthened my faith even, just by knowing the Jews' approach to dealing with God and with Messiah.
The more that people know, the more it helps them. I mean, to me, that's the whole point of what we're doing with this series.
Certainly.
And I am, as a catastrophism researcher, I'm always interested in things that give people an edge. And If there's one thing that really gives you an edge is the ability to think outside the box, which means you got to challenge your own belief systems, examine the belief systems of others objectively. You use what works for you, and what you don't use, move beyond it.
I think I told you the first day I was on the job as a brand new engineer, I found out that the formula we had been taught for predicting bending stress in a beam in school was not correct. It had to be corrected. And that was a great revelation to me. On the defense of the professors, however, the man who derived the correction and new procedure did it while I was in school. But I understand that they're still teaching it the same way, in spite of that.
This is just great stuff for listeners out there. With that, I'm going to ask you a quick question before we run out of time here, because we just got a few minutes left. What do you think is the most amazing Bible prophecy?
To me, it's strictly my own opinion, but I believe that most people would agree. It's Daniel's prediction of when Messiah, son of David, would walk into Jerusalem as the Redeemer. And he did it exactly on the day that was prophesied. They'd been marking off their calendars for 483 years because that's when he was supposed to arrive. From the time that Artaxerxes, king of Persia, gave the commandment to Nehemiah to go forth and rebuild the city and the temple, it would be 483 years. But that the Messiah would be killed, then be scattered. And that prophecy is in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And it happened exactly on the date that he prophesied. On the 10th of Nisan, Jesus rode into Jerusalem with people throwing down their cloaks and palm fronds in his path, proclaiming him, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So they knew that was the day, and that was him. And some of the priests, of course, were cautioning him not to say that. And he said to them, I'll tell you, if they didn't say it, these stones would cry out. And that verse came to me and my then wife, Beth, as we walked down the Mount of Olives, stumbling through those stones. That verse came out in my chest and in my head. It was marvelous to remember.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's pick up on this a little bit more in the next segment. And I want to ask you, how did the Jewish people know, let me put this in quotation marks, when? To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the second part of Episode 6, The Most Amazing Prophecy. All right, Bob. There's the question. How did the Jewish people know, in quotation marks, when? Because not all of them knew. And how could people outside of Jerusalem even hope to know?
Well, they should have known, because we have pointed out that those who read and studied the Tanakh should have been marking off the years on their calendars.
So, who is knowing what and when?
Well, Artaxerxes was king at a specific time, and he gave this commission to Nehemiah in writing. It said that anybody who interfered with him in his mission was going to have to deal with Artaxerxes himself. And he made it plain that he was really behind it. But counting off the years to that time was just a matter of their Jewish calendar. Now, when we get to technical Harrys of this age, who want to go back and check that and see if was that really 483 years or blah blah. It gets very technical
All right.
because of a couple of factors. First factor is, I might say, that our Gregorian calendar, Jesus was born in 4 BC.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a correction that has to be made.
So how did you come up with this 4 BC figure?
I didn't come up with it. Scholars have determined that from other events that they've put together, and they have found that Pope Gregory's calendar has that error. It begins, what year 1 would be when they marked it down, but actually it should have been 4 years earlier than that.
Okay.
They didn't have the information that we have now, and communication wasn't as good. We're smarter now.
All right.
They did pretty well.
But has this new understanding of the actual birth date of Jesus, is this common knowledge? Is it being taught to Christians?
It's well documented.
Is it being taught?
No, I don't think so.
Why?
They probably don't think it's important.
You hold on a second. You ask any kid about their birthday, and immediately they're thinking about chocolate cake. How could you say this is being 4 years off on the birth date is not important?
99% of the people that you would talk to wouldn't even know what you're talking about if you said the Gregorian calendar that was generated by Pope Gregory the 13th.
Well, I understand all of that, but we're still back to a basic issue of people do not fundamentally understand exactly when he was born and how old he was when he died.
Well, they would if they knew what I've been telling you. Yeshua's birth date and age can be verified by the Haftorah for Rosh Hashanah, Isaiah 61, because he had to be 30 years old in order to preach.
That's right. But so this is another example of a secret that is withheld from the public.
I wouldn't say it's withheld, it's just neglected to be released.
But it's neglected by the people who know better.
Yeah, they should tell them about it.
Yeah, I think so.
That's also tradition has suppressed and distorted the truth. My mission is to correct this.
It's nice that you did.
It's not emphasized that much in Sunday school teaching and in church pulpit sermons. They don't look at in the detail that we're talking about. That's why the church has not been friendly to me. The rabbis have been more friendly to me with my work than the church has. And we're coming to another one that's similar to this. There was a Rabbi Hillel II in the 4th century who revised the Jewish calendar, oy vey. And he either didn't leave very good tracks about how he had changed it and why, or else the details have been lost since that time. And so even the Jewish calendar is subject to some error.
Right.
In fact, it's worse off than the Gregorian calendar in the fact that we don't know how much it's off. It may be only a year, it may be only a few months, it may be 10 years, we don't know. But Asher Kaufman agreed with my emphasis on that when he reviewed my book, and he said that was very important to remember.
Okay. The question that keeps going through my mind, I mean, because we talked about Watergate, right? And so now it's like, what did you know and when did you know it?
Mm-hmm.
And on this thing where you're talking about the most amazing Bible prophecy, that gets to the point of who knew what and who knew it when. So could you answer that in terms of this prophecy and who exactly knew it and in what position were they to do anything about it?
The people knew of this prophecy. They read the Tanakh.
Mm-hmm.
And the priests knew of this prophecy also.
Well, the people that could read the Tanakh. The people that had access to it.
Anybody would have occasion to know about this prophecy.
Right.
There's another interesting thing here. In answer to the technical Harrys,
Mm-hmm.
there was a brilliant British scholar, Sir Robert Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in the 19th century, born 1841, died 1918, but in 1894, he published one of several books, and the one book that I'm referring to here is The Coming Prince. And he went in there and calculated back to the time of Artaxerxes, and in very detailed fashion, almost like I would expect Asher Kaufman to do. He very carefully analyzed it for people to see how they arrived at that date. That it was, in fact, 483 years on the 10th of Nisan in the year AD 30.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful book. It's in the, what I have is about the 8th printing of the 5th edition, 1894. Also, there was a fellow named Hillel the Elder, not to be confused with Hillel II.
Mm-hmm.
And he commissioned Rabbi Uziel to write something like the Living Bible that we have, something in the people's plain language, and leave out all the really theological highbrow stuff. And it was called the Targum.
Mm-hmm.
So he did. And oh my gosh, he wrote it and told it like it really was.
Mm-hmm.
The rabbis were upset. Oh boy, because he told them these prophecies and when they were going to be fulfilled and what they meant and so on. And he was severely criticized. It was the end of his career. They banished him. He did a good work.
Okay, doke, Bob.
Yes.
I want to throw a monkey wrench at you. Because one of the things I see time and time again is that historical information is, frankly, just perverted because it suits the needs of the church. So here's the question. Since we already have the birth of Jesus is skewed, nobody knows exactly when he was born, not because somebody couldn't figure out how to write the Bible, but because some mathematicians figured out a flaw in the Julian calendar. And so he was born 4 years earlier, and consequently people don't know his real age at the time of his death. Another one, to me, is Palm Sunday. All right? I'm going to ask you, did Jesus walk to Bethany on Saturday?
He was with Zacchaeus and the disciples at Jericho, which is about 15 miles east of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And so it says in the gospel, they traveled to Bethany, and the next day he rode into Jerusalem. Well, if he had arrived there on a Saturday, the next day would have been Sunday. And so that's why everybody says it's Palm Sunday. They're forgetting the Jewish law. You cannot walk 15 miles. You can't even walk 3/4 of a mile on Saturday if you're Jewish and obeying the law. So they'd had to have walked on what we would call Sunday, the first day of the week, which is what they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And they obtained donkey, and then the next day he rode into Jerusalem, which would have been Monday, and it would have been the 10th of Nisan. And that's significant, the fact that it's the 10th of Nisan.
So, in other words, what is called Palm Sunday today is in fact Palm Monday.
Should be, yes.
Should be.
It's like the scapegoat.
Yeah. Okay, you got me on that one.
We've always done it that way, you know.
We've always done it that way. Good. Well, in the next segment, we'll get into it with a new question. Were miracles still present after the crucifixion? You up for that?
Right.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the third and final part of Episode 6, The Most Amazing Prophecy. Okay, Bob. Here we are in this third part of this episode, and the question I have for you is, were miracles still present after the crucifixion?
We talked about Simeon the Righteous and miracles that occurred during his tenure and occasionally afterwards. And when they did occur, they were looked upon as a good omen.
Mm-hmm.
And all through the Talmud, repeatedly, you see this lamenting tone that comes out in the print even. And they'll say that 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the lot piece never came up in the right hand. And 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the crimson strap never turned white. And so they never say what happened 40 years before the temple was destroyed, but all you have to do is subtract 40 from 70, and that's 30. And there was a very significant event that occurred in Jerusalem up on the Mount of Olives at that time. And they say the two logs for the altar never lasted for burning 40 years before the temple was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And the one most important, I think, is the westernmost light never outlasted the others during the 40 years before the temple was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And they noted this, and it really impressed them. That westernmost candle was the one that was the closest to the Shekinah, who was in the temple and in the Holy of Holies, his little earth-bound apartment.
Mm-hmm.
Disciples worshipped there. They were Jews. A lot of people resent that. And it says I think it's the last sentence in the book of Luke, and it says, and they continued to worship in the temple every day after Jesus ascended to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Why would they go there if the temple was no longer valid, if the Shekinah was not still in place? There's another point. There are some conservative theologians who insist that the New Testament was written about 100, 150 years after the crucifixion. Well, it's real simple to prove that that's incorrect because of two events that do not appear in the New Testament. And one of them is the destruction of the temple. Jesus predicted it. He said it would be destroyed and not one stone would be standing upon another.
Mm-hmm.
And another one is the departure of the Shekinah from the temple. Boy, don't you think they would have rubbed that in on the priests if the Shekinah departed their temple? That was a sign that, hey, I'm through with you guys. So that shows
It's God saying, I am so out of here?
right out of here
Oh, okay.
are reported, and his ascension into heaven. None of those are reported in the New Testament.
Okay.
So they occurred 66, the year 66, and then 70 after he sat there for 3.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that Paul was executed about 63, and James was martyred in 62. Those aren't reported in the Bible.
All right.
Paul says he is going to be, but nothing about James.
So give me a wrap on it. Give me the so what bottom line.
Bottom line is that the New Testament was written in the first century while it was happening, or shortly after. In the case of some of the books of Paul, the epistles,
Mm-hmm.
because they certainly would have mentioned those events which showed that Israel was not in good favor with the Lord. and then they were scattered shortly afterward. The smart Jews and Christians got out of Dodge when they executed James.
Right.
He was so righteous. They said he was the second most righteous man who ever lived, and they called him the man with camel knees. He had spent so much time on his knees praying, he had big calluses on his knees like a camel has. He was thrown off of the pinnacle of the temple, the southeast corner, which is about 350-foot fall, and he was still alive when he got down at the bottom. Josephus tells about this. And so they stoned him, and he was still alive. And a fuller, what we call a weaver, came by, and as a part of his equipment, he had a large beam, probably about the size of a 2x4, and he put poor James out of his misery. And a Greek Christian family put him in their tomb, which is right nearby, and you can see it today, the tomb of Hezir, a Greek family.
Okay.
And so that all that argument about James' ossuary and so forth can't be settled by that, because there's nothing in that tomb right now. Looters, they take everything they see.
All right. Here's a different bottom line. What I hear you saying is that there were none of Simeon's miracles during the final 40 years, from the crucifixion to the time the Second Temple was destroyed, right?
Yes.
How was this perceived by the Jewish people as a whole at that time?
Some of the priests were among the first converts to Christianity because they saw this. They were in and around the temple grounds, and they were aware that none of these things had occurred, and they put it all together and said, uh-oh, I think we made a mistake. And they started looking back probably to the Tanakh, and said, sure enough, he arrived on the 10th of Nisan in 38. That was 483 years, just like Daniel had told us. And so where were we? My God, we missed it. And so a lot of them were among the first people converted to Christianity.
Okay. But at that time, Christianity had no resemblance to what it is today.
Oh, no.
At that time, Christianity was a sect of Judaism.
Exactly.
Jews were the first Christians.
Right.
Today, if you ask an Orthodox Jew to define Reform Judaism, they'll just say it's Unitarian with the Torah. In other words, they're a fringe element group. So take me back to these early first Jews.
One argument they had that is described in the New Testament was whether Gentiles who are converted to believe in Yeshua, whether they were held to law, that they have to be circumcised. And Paul convinced them, after much discussion with Peter and with James, he finally convinced them that no, Gentiles are not held to the law. Only Jews are held to the law, but they can be unified in worshiping Yeshua as their Savior, as the Son of God. That was a big controversy that they had for a while. But Paul was finally able to convince them, convince James, who was the bishop, if you will, of the sect whom we referred to. That answers your question.
Well, it does in part. I mean, there's another aspect to this, and why Christianity diverged from its roots, because until Rome stepped in, I really do find myself in agreement with very early Christians that men and women must be co-equals, must be in harmony. How did we lose the harmony, Bob?
Women and men are different.
Well, I've noticed.
And God knows that. And that's why he put into the law that women were not to be preaching. They were to be keeping the home and taking care of the children. He wanted the men to man up and take over that particular element.
But I understand early Christians, they violated the law
No.
because you said, according to the Bible, women couldn't lead the services, but in early Christian families, that's exactly what the women did.
Paul's epistles are very clear about the fact that women are not even supposed to be deacons or any kind of preaching or teaching in the church. Sunday school hadn't been invented yet, or he may have said something about that. I don't know. But women are more tending to go emotional than men are. Men are more like, hey, the X is here and then Y is there. There's where we go. And God knows that. He knows that they are different, and that's why he put that in the law.
But men are much more violent than women.
Pardon me?
Men are much more violent than women. What do you see? Armies of 10,000 women marching out and raising and slaughtering and destroying entire countries?
That's another area.
Well, no, I think it's relevant to this because I really do see where Christianity shortchanges women. The Christianity of today. That's just my opinion.
Even in the temple courts, women were forbidden to ascend the 13 steps to Nicanor's gate. There is no scriptural evidence of women teaching in Christian worship. And through history, some women have been pretty good soldiers.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say was that I believe if more Christians would stop and think that the first Christians were Jews, it might diminish some of the anti-Semitism that we live with today.
I sure would love that.
People in church don't realize that. You don't hear it from the pulpit. At least I can't ever recall any minister pointing that out.
It's always denial of the history, but, that's an old story. And frankly, I think if Christianity had not taken a left turn with the Council of Nicaea, it would have been different today.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Council of Nicaea. That's where the Church of the East departed from the Roman Church. The Church of the East is what generated the Peshitta, which I have and I've talked to you about as the Lamsa Bible. George Lamsa translated the Peshitta from the original Aramaic
Right.
into English for our use. And the Church of the East exists today.
Mm-hmm.
They're in countries where you would not imagine, like Iraq, Afghanistan, even Nepal and China,
Mm-hmm.
east of the Caucasus.
Mm-hmm.
Probably comprise less than 1 million people. But they have, despite the fact they have 5 bitterly opposed factions, just like we do, they have one scripture, and it has never been changed in 2,000 years. We can't make that claim.
Well, we can't. But that gives me an idea for a question.
Okay?
Because we have just a few minutes left in this segment, and I'm just dying to ask this one question. Because we talked about Indiana Jones and how they, the Ark of the Covenant, they got that all wrong in the movie and all that. But I forgot to ask you a question back then.
Oh.
Is there a real, and I say in quotes, Indiana Jones? Did you come across somebody that kind of fit that role?
Yes, there was. Unfortunately, the late Vendell Jones was the person who inspired that character. George Lucas and Harrison Ford came across his work. He was a Baptist minister and archaeologist from Arlington, Texas, and he put out the word that he was looking for the Ark of the Covenant because he was scurrying around the Mideast and doing a lot of writing and researching and put out papers and so forth. And he wanted people to think he was looking for the Ark of the Covenant, but he was really searching for the ashes of the red heifer, because he had found over in Jordan in a museum copper scroll that gave the directions, just like a treasure hunt.
Mm-hmm.
It gave the directions of where the cave was, where the ashes were hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And he photographed that, and he was married to an Israeli wife who knew ancient Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
and she translated it for him. And they, sure enough, they went over in the Qumran Valley there, near where that first urn was found, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And it said that there was a wadi that had a cave that faced eastward, and on the floor of the cave was a marble floor. And he searched around there until he sure enough found a cave that met that description. And it was dangerous working there because they had cave-ins, and not only that, they had trouble with the Israeli Antiquities Organization. They had all kinds of problems. They used volunteers, people like myself, to go over there and work, and they could only work from November until April. They had a very short time because it was so hot in that desert, they just could not work.
Mm-hmm.
He worked about 18 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And they found one thing after another, as we talked about earlier. He found the urn that contained the anointing oil for the priests and the kings.
Mm-hmm.
And he found a couple of kilos of incense for the altar of incense,
Mm-hmm.
which was comprised largely of cinnamon, about 8 different varieties of cinnamon, which we had talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He is the person who supposedly inspired that character. However, a few years ago, he passed away from pancreatic cancer. He suffered for a number of years. He continued working even while he was really deathly ill. Nobody could understand how he could keep going.
You know what? Doing the research when you're sick
Yeah,
helps you get through it.
you get strength from.
Yeah. Well, that is interesting. Vendel Jones.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And a TV evangelist who knew him, said he was a buddy, told me, whatever you do, don't refer to Vendel Jones, because he's a loose cannon in the evangelical community, and you will just get dirt on yourself from associating with him. This is a buddy, what kind of buddy is that?
Yeah.
I feel like, hey, the truth is the truth. And that's what I'm commanded to find. And God will take care of whatever occurs after I find the truth and deal with it. It's his problem, not mine. So I associate with Vendel's discoveries. And biblical archaeology never mentioned one thing that he found.
Mm.
And he took them before the rabbinical authorities, and they checked them out.
And they're the real thing.
The oil and the incense, and they were the real thing.
Wow.
And I believe, as I've told you before, that he also found the ashes, because they don't talk about it anymore. I haven't heard anything.
Well, then that brings us up to what we're going to be talking about in the next episode in the series, the Red Heifer Ceremony. And I think we're going to have some fun with that.
Roger that.
This concludes Episode 6, The Most Amazing Prophecy. Next up, please join us for Episode 7, The Red Heifer Ceremony. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Reiland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com.
I have a word for
Curtain?
anything else. Yeah, later on, it's in Josephus, he calls it a Babylonian curtain,
Mm-hmm.
and which is more descriptive of what it really was.
Mm-hmm.
The other two veils inside separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place.
So then when these veils were replaced,
Mm-hmm.
did they actually replace this every 6 months, the entire thing, or did they refurbish it?
They replaced it every 6 months.
My gosh, that must have been immensely expensive.
In between times, they did wash it because it was exposed to the weather
Mm-hmm.
and dust and so forth. There were some ceremonies where they threw blood on,
Mm-hmm.
it.
In our last episode, Secrets Revealed, we ended on the three veils in the second temple, but there's still some more detail we need to cover. And so, what I wanted to know is, were the veils replaced occasionally?
Yes, they were replaced every 6 months. They were braided, of course, by 82 young damsels, as it says. They wouldn't want mature ladies with arthritic joints because they wanted this thing to be perfect,
Mm-hmm.
much as possible. And they were probably teenage girls. They used 74 cords of 22 threads each. And as I understand the veil, it
Shalom, and welcome to Episode 6 of the Great Tribulation, the most amazing prophecy. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Reiland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 6, The Most Amazing Prophecy.
Well, Bob,
it was a hand-bread, but it had on it cherubims and stars, and I think maybe palm trees. They won't let people see an image of the veil. They're afraid someone will make a replica of it. I am honored by having Barbara and our names engraved in a brass plaque as members of the Temple Society.
mm-hmm.
They won't even give little old me a picture of the veil. I've tried everywhere I know. They don't want anybody copying it. It's just sacred
Now, why is that?
because it hangs in front of the entrance to the temple. Inside the temple is even more sacred. In the Exodus, it describes it as an hanging. There's a Greek word for the veil that says something that spreads out and hangs down. Okay.
So,
Mm-hmm.
is there any numerical significance to 82 damsels, 74 cords, and 22 threads?
Not that I know of, other than the fact I think it's a physical requirement in order to get the veil to be 4 finger breadths thick. They needed to have braids of that configuration, that many cords, that many threads.
It was that thick. How tall was it?
60 feet,
Wow.
30 feet wide.
Wow.
Yeah. They call it a veil, but that's not really a veil. They don't really